Hi, my name is Monsignor John Woods, or Father John Woods more commonly. I'm a priest of the Archdiocese of Canberra and Goulburn, ordained in 1978. And over those years, I've been in various parishes, and currently I'm the parish priest of Transfiguration Parish, North Woden, centred on the suburb of Curtin in the ACT. I also have the position of Vicar for Education in the Archdiocese, and over the years I've had various other positions. However, through all that time, I've been someone very interested in sport. When I was first ordained, I was appointed to the parish of Queanbeyan, just outside of Canberra. And at that time, I got to know various folk in the parish, including the Ferner family, Don Ferner being the first coach of the Canberra Raiders. I played a bit with the Queanbeyan Whites rugby union team, lower grades, mind you, and that was indicative of my enjoyment of sport at various levels, but also indicative of, while I had a go, I was never particularly a standout in any sport, although, as I said, I'd had a go, be it at school football, rugby union, Aussie rules, squash, tennis, and in more recent times, following then, running. I've run a couple of marathons, a good number of Canberra Times fun runs. And further to that, when I was growing up, I was greatly influenced by being a member of the second Marnock or St Christopher's Cathedral Scout troop, headed by Father Barry Cotter, Kevin Barry Cotter, then administrator of St Christopher's Cathedral. This is all by way of saying I've had an engagement of the physical and active. And indeed, when I was growing up, I had aspirations not to be successful in a particular sport, but in fact to be a racing driver. I used to love the annual Bathurst 500 and then 1000 when it included standard production cars. And I had a desire to do something about that when I left school. Anyway, things turned out differently. I was ordained in 78, appointed to Queanbeyan. And after study in canon law at St Paul's University in Ottawa, I returned to Queanbeyan for some 9 months in 1985. And at the time, there was a farewell gathering for the Anglican priest who was moving on. And I only met him at the farewell dinner. And in discussion, he mentioned about how he was tying up loose ends. But one thing he hadn't been able to get someone to take on was that of chaplain to the Canberra Raiders. And I expressed some interest. He explained some more. One thing led to another. I met with the then coach, as I mentioned earlier, Don Ferner, the initial coach of the Canberra Raiders, and then CEO John McIntyre. And in 1986, I commenced as chaplain to the Canberra Raiders under the auspices of what was then known as the Sports and Leisure Ministry, an ecumenical group that has since morphed into what is known as Sports Chaplaincy Australia. A little more about them later. However, when I began in 1986, there was no guidebook. There was no, this is how you be a chaplain. So I'd been keen on the running, as I said. So I decided I'd join in those activities, those training activities where I could, simply to get to know the players and have a sense of being one with them. I've described it as loitering with intent. That's not original to me, but it did describe what I was trying to do. I thought if you were around, if you engaged, there was acceptance in time and so on. And indeed, that's how it panned out. I'd turn up to training on Tuesday nights. Bear in mind too that football, rugby league, like the major codes then, was not full-time professional. And the fellas would come in on a Tuesday and a Thursday evening, particularly for training. And the Tuesday training was usually focused on exercise. And as I said, I'd join in. And by virtue of that and developing some friendships and being around and so on, this led to some individual talks and on occasions over the years, prayer with fellows, weddings, baptisms and funerals. It also led to similar with support and office staff. And from my point of view too, I often drew on that experience with the Raiders for not only had I shared or tried to share who I was and the faith that motivated me, but I was also able to share things I'd learned from them. And one thing that stood out for me during that whole time, and I've reflected on this recently, was that at all times there was respect for the position and what I stood for. And this was from fellows of, well, Catholic faith, other Christian traditions, no faith affiliation, Muslims, and others of a mixture of whatever. But there's also always been a respect. If I might, just to give some context, some theoretical understanding to that whole enterprise, which has continued, as I said, since 1986, and for me reached a highlight last year, 2022, when at the Mel Meninga presentation dinner, I was completely taken aback to be awarded life membership of the Raiders. And this is quite an honour, insofar as in the history of the Raiders, there only been 10 folk inducted as life members, and I think it's only 4 who are still alive. And it was an affirmation for reasons I didn't quite understand, but I was proud to accept, of the value of chaplaincy. I noticed, and this was a certain irony for me at least, that at the time that happened, the CEO of Essendon, who'd been appointed, was, he withdrew by virtue of controversy over comments made by a pastor of a church where he had identified with. So on the one hand, here we have a reaction to religious commitment, and at the same time, in another code, very much an affirmation of it. Perhaps it reflects a diversity of experience and understanding. For myself, though, theoretically, if I might quote from a talk I gave in 2008, talking about sport and life, because it helps situate my attitude to the whole issue of sport and evangelisation. And in that talk, I said this, and I quote, "I identify with the affirmation of the philosopher William James, the priest sociologist Andrew Greeley, the theologian Richard P. McBrien, and the spiritual writer Richard Rohr, that one's experience is the basis of the religious life. McBrien has made the point that theology not based on experience is not theology, but a philosophy of religion." In 1986, I'd suggest Pope John Paul II affirmed as much when he spoke of the need for the Australian Church to be enriched by the experience of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. I continued, "I especially identify with a saying dear to Rohr, namely that, quote, God comes to you disguised as your life. The potential of my life and that of all humanity, in fact, all of creation, is in a beautiful and disturbing way best expressed in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the one who boldly proclaimed that I am the way, the truth, and the life. The mission of the church is to articulate and celebrate that which is consistent with the mission of Jesus." And further to that, and there's much one could say, I remember being struck in the seminary, and as I've reflected on it over the years, the point made by Thomas Aquinas that all knowledge is via the senses. All knowledge is via the senses. Knowledge is a essential experience. Yes, we reflect on it, but it comes via the senses. And I also take to heart the affirmation of the Second Vatican Council, the church is to be a sign and instrument of God's presence in the world. And I'd suggest that the role of the church with respect to sport, and indeed in all its missionary endeavours, is to identify, articulate, and celebrate the presence of God in the world. And I'd suggest that sport, in its many forms, be it in team or individual pursuit, offers what I might call a theophany or an insight into the something more of human experience. We're made for more than just where we are. And sport can offer an insight into that. And I'd suggest that experience is in part explaining why sport is so popular, particularly in Australia. Australia, in many ways, from its very foundation, was found as a secular society. And perhaps, as Ronald Rolheiser says, there is a disease or a disquiet within us that we're not sufficient to ourselves in terms of our deepest longing, that sport offers something of an insight to that which comes to the fore if you put aside or attempt to put aside the religious. And in some ways, people are experiencing the something more of life in sport, although they're not necessarily articulating it in terms of religious categories. Again, there's a quote that I resonate with, and you may have heard before, and that is, a mystic is not a special kind of human being. Rather, every human being is a special kind of mystic. Within all of us, there is this desire, this searching, or as Augustine said, our hearts are restless till they rest in God. And that restlessness and the desire for something more and the experience beyond the mundane is somehow manifest in sport. Pope John Paul II, himself a keen sportsman and a man who was embedded in the phenomenological approach to life, and this was reflected in his theology of the body, he was the one who in 2004 established a Pontifical Council for the Laity. 2004, with respect, is not that long ago. And yet it was the beginning, and only then the beginning, of a structured and official approach to try to engage with the phenomenon of sport, which Pope John Paul II referred to as a sign of our times. As things progressed, and as my own reflection on my involvement with the Raiders and sport more generally developed, if I move forward to April 2016, I, along with Alison Burt from the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference and facilitated by the excellent work of Philomena Billington, former director of the Sandhurst Catholic Education Office and now consultant across Australia, we put together with other folk a proposal for the then Bishops' Commission for Pastoral Life to have a more structured involvement around sport as a means of evangelisation. We proposed an advisory group to develop an integrated approach. We called for theological reflection. Perhaps this could be a task specifically given to ACU and or Notre Dame. We pushed for schools' involvement. We pushed for the affirmation of parents, as in this area, as in all others, as first teachers. And we thought that there'd be great potential for ecumenical interfaith involvement. And here I refer to the aforementioned Sports Chaplaincy Australia. That group is essentially made up of folk from various Protestant traditions, some evangelical, some more overtly Pentecostal. Very few Catholics are involved. And yet they have, across Australia, both from the elite level down to the grassroots weekend children and adult sporting events, chaplains now, or at least that's what they're endeavouring to do, and they're slowly getting out there. In many ways, we can learn from them, but I think, and I mean this with respect, we bring a richness of theology and breadth of understanding that goes beyond what I've encountered as sometimes perhaps a limited experience, one that is not as incarnational as the best of Catholic theology is. And I believe nonetheless that it is an opportunity in this common ground of sport to engage ecumenically and indeed not the least with our Muslim brothers and sisters. In more recent times, all of these issues, of course, have developed, and as the church continues to develop, so sport. And so we see the increase of women's sport in areas where only a matter of years ago there was an absence. I refer specifically, of course, to the various football codes and women's cricket at the international level. There is also greater awareness of issues that touch into the position of the church on these matters, namely the integrity of the individual must always be foremost. Christian anthropology is based on each and every person being made in the image and likeness of God, and sport should further that awareness, not undermine it. And so, as with any human activities, there can be occasions where, in fact, the good of sport can be undermined by professional imperatives to win at all cost, or indeed to political influence through sport. And the church can bring a cautionary balance, I'd suggest, that often perhaps sporting bodies themselves don't pay due attention to. And in that regard, I'd like to refer to the document produced in 2018, a document from the Vatican called Giving the Best of Yourself, the Christian Perspective on Sport and the Human Person. This came from the Dicastery for Laity and Family Life. Now, this gathering was the second that had been sponsored by the Vatican. I was privileged by invitation to attend the first in 2016 Sport at the Service of Humanity, the first global conference on sport and faith. Now, I mentioned those two gatherings because I think they really began to put sport front and centre of much of the pastoral outreach of the church, and indeed the Australian church, notwithstanding a sporting culture in Australia, is only now beginning to really come on board in a structured way. The conference in 2016 involved folk from the highest level at Formula One, rugby union, NFL, National Football League in America, player coaches, the head of international women's tennis, the head of women's basketball, etc. And it also involved folk who were working at the grassroots with those who were unable to compete on an equal footing with their brothers and sisters by virtue of physical and or mental handicaps. And it was a great experience. And again, the conference in 2022, which I was unable to attend, affirmed that sport is for all. It's not just for a few, it's for all. It was noteworthy there that Thomas Bach, the head of the International Olympic Committee, spoke of the Olympic motto moving from faster, higher, stronger to the addition now of the word together. I mentioned that because I think there's a certain synergy with the call of Pope Francis for a more synodal church and the Olympic Committee, including the notion of together. The synergy with together and synodality, I'd suggest, is obvious. We're in this together or we're not in it at all. But surely it's a movement of the Holy Spirit when the International Olympic Committee can add the notion of together to their motto, and Pope Francis is calling for synodality. So bringing all that together, if I may, and I've moved back and forth, the approach of the church to sport is based in a Christian anthropology, which affirms the good and the dignity of the individual in community. It's a holistic or integral approach, therefore. It's founded in the affirmation that every individual is made in the image and likeness of God. It's founded in the understanding of the church not being apart from, but encountering, sharing with and dialoguing with those involved in sport, and affirming the body or the material awareness that we all have in many ways in the first instance. And yet through that, trying to open up to a deeper understanding and meaning to address the ongoing seeking of the something more, as I might call it, in life. It's been affirmed, sport that is, as one of the signs of the times. And yet, because it is a human activity, it has and on occasion, sadly, has shown a dark side, be it through cheating, gambling and manipulation of competitors, and doping and the like. But the church acknowledges sport and seeks to engage. Now, in terms of the Australian experience, I commend the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference, and particularly the folk working in the area of evangelisation under the direction of the Archbishop of Canberra and Goulburn, Christopher Prowse. I believe that we need to give a structural, systematic, inclusive, or bring together a number of elements. As I said earlier, the notion of the individual, those involved in sport, the understanding that all are called to share in the benefits, that it can be an opportunity for people to experience a theophany, but as good as it gets in sport, that's not as good as it gets in terms of the human journey, if I might put it that way. At the same time, I'm conscious of my own involvement and my own age, and the need in this area, as for so many others, for perhaps beginnings, but also succession. I think in the Australian Church, we have the experience, particularly with respect to religious brothers in schools, helping many young boys and religious sisters, to a lesser extent perhaps, young girls, appreciate something of their God-given dignity through the gift of sport. However, I don't know that they articulated that experience, but anecdotally, people will to this day witness to the positive influence that those religious brothers and sisters had on them. I think now we need to be more upfront. We need to articulate and engage. And if we're going to walk together with folk involved in sport, we need to be very mindful that while we can contribute, we can also learn from those involved in sport. Synodality, or walking together, is not a one-way street. In conclusion, perhaps I could do no better than share with you a reflection by a gentleman by the name of George Leonard. And he speaks of the ultimate athlete as one who joins body, mind, and spirit in the dance of existence, who surpasses limitations and crosses boundaries in the process of personal and social transformation, who plays the larger game, the game of games, with full awareness, aware of life and death, and willing to accept the pain and joy that awareness brings, who finally best serves as model and guide on our evolutionary journey. To me, that captures an understanding of sport and indeed evangelisation, which doesn't exhaust the latter, but is consistent with it, and affords us an opportunity to engage with all people of goodwill in the area of sport. And finally, if I might, in terms of the proposal that I spoke of earlier in 2016, I think we need to be mindful that sport is about physical activity, competitive play, if you like. But let's not restrict our reflections to sport as such. The fact is we all have a body, to state the obvious. From the chubby little gurgling baby to the very active teenager, to the elite sportsman or woman, to the middle-aged person, to the pensioner who shuffles down to the shops. We all have this experience of being embodied unities of body and soul. And how might we help in an aging population, one given to the visual, one with problems of obesity and body image, and the sharing of so much information, which can often be detrimental, an understanding of the body, which is affirming of the uniqueness of every individual, the right of all to engage and to enjoy sport according to their ability, and an understanding that whatever stage in life we are, as I said, the little bub or the teenager or the elite athlete or the old couple who goes for a walk after dinner, that our bodily experiences open us up or offer a theophany into the something more of our limited existence in one sense, yes, but the potential we have to engage with the fullness of life in Christ in and through the faith community. I'm giving a broad sweep there, but while we need to speak of sport, we need to speak of our bodily understanding. And I think I've said it before, Pope Francis, who spoke of the theology of the body, and I know he spoke with an understanding of the dignity of the individual in their totality. Sadly, I think the church's understanding or the perceived understanding of the theology of the body is often restricted to matters with respect and being blunt to the groin. I'd like to think of a womb to tomb, from the top of our heads to the soles of our feet. Our bodies are our constant, and in and through them, we experience the something more of life, and in and through all experiences, we can experience something of the call of God to engage with this beautiful mystery and gift of life. I'll leave it there with those thoughts, and I wish the Bishop's Commission for Evangelisation every success in their endeavours to help us better appreciate sport and the fact of our bodily existence more generally. Thank you.